I've been reading a lot of moral philosophy and thoughts on distributive justice lately. After reading Michael Sandel's excellent Justice and one of his follow-ups, The Tyranny of Merit, I became interested in thinking about how different models of justice may apply to a single scenario or thought experiment. By doing this, I'm hoping I'll understand more clearly the differences and values that each school holds as primary. I'm also going to look at some areas outside of our thought experiment where members of each community critique other schools of thought. Without further ado, here is my thought experiment. A small community, let's call it Roseland, is considering building a public hospital on a strip of land on the outskirts of town. There is a single homeowner who lives on the land where the hospital would sit. They do not want to sell. The hospital would be a huge economic boom for the area and will lead to better health outcomes for many community members, especially those who currently lack reliable health care. The mayor is considering using eminent domain to force the homeowner to move so the hospital can be built. Should the mayor use eminent domain to force the homeowner to sell so the hospital can be built? Let's start by looking at utilitarianism, our first school of thought. Per Wikipedia, utilitarian ideas encourage actions that ensure the greatest good for the greatest number. Although different varieties of utilitarianism admit different characterizations, the basic idea behind all of them, in some sense, is to maximize utility, which is often defined in terms of well-being or related concepts. For instance, Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, described utility thus: that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, or to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. In this case, using utilitarianism thinking, the mayor could justify the seizing of private property as the benefit of the many, the town would be greater than the pain of the single homeowner. Whether or not compensation should be paid to the homeowner would be a legal, not a moral question. Would there be a situation where the above does not hold true? Yes. Let's say that in addition to the single homeowner, the property is home to a rare and endangered species of animals. Peter Singer is one of the most famous contemporary utilitarian philosophers in the world. Per his Wikipedia page, he is especially known for arguing that the well-being of all sentient beings ought to be given equal consideration. In this amended scenario, in addition to calculating the pain of the single homeowner being forced from their home, we would have to add the further loss of any animals harmed in the building of the hospital. In this scenario, it is quite possible that we would determine that the building of the hospital at this location would not be a just decision. One of the biggest and most contentious questions of utilitarianism is how to properly calculate positive and negative impacts of any decision. Per ChatGPT, there are at least two camps. Act utilitarianism evaluates each individual action based on its consequences, while rule utilitarianism assesses actions based on adherence to rules that, when followed, generally produce the greatest good for society. A rules utilitarian may bristle at the use of eminent domain in this case if, for instance, the mayor of Roseland rejected an earlier proposal that would have taken land from wealthier individuals only to now support eminent domain when it affects a single poor homeowner, or if the law was passed under private legislation, meaning that the homeowner would have no way of knowing what the fair process to removing them from the home would be. In 1971, John Rawls published one of the most famous works of political philosophy in modern times, A Theory of Justice. Rawls has several ideas that have reverberated since the publication of his book. The most famous contribution is probably the veil of ignorance, or original position, which is the first stage in a four-stage sequence. Per the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article entitled The Argument for the Difference Principle and the Four-Stage Sequence, 3 further stages expand upon and elaborate the original position to apply these principles to determine the justice of legislation and social policies that affect the relevant basic social institutions. The veil of ignorance is a thought experiment where we imagine that we are self-interested parties designing a society without knowing our position, who we would be in it. We would not know, for instance, if we were to be born to rich or poor parents. This thought experiment is designed to force individuals to consider what would be a just society behind the veil of ignorance. From the above article, the second or constitutional stage then is the application of the principles of justice to determine the most appropriate political constitution for a well-ordered society with the constitutional powers and procedures of government and the constitutional rights of citizens. To make this decision, Rawls says the veil of ignorance must be lifted enough so that the parties to an ideal constitutional convention know relevant general facts about their society, such as its natural circumstances and resources, the level of economic advance, and its political culture. but the parties still do not know any particular information about individuals within society, including themselves. The third stage of the four-stage sequence is the legislative stage, where ideal legislators correctly apply and satisfy the principles of justice, but also respect the limits laid down by a just constitution. The veil of ignorance is lifted further at this stage so that ideal legislators have requisite knowledge of local facts that they need to address the particular problems they are trying to resolve by legislation and more general social policies. It is at the legislative stage that Rawls says that the difference principle is to be applied once all the relevant factual information within a particular society is available that bears on decisions regarding the organization of the economy and the institution or property. The fourth and final stage of the four-stage sequence is the application of laws and rules to particular cases by judges and administrators, and ultimately by citizens generally in making decisions about what laws and rules require of them. At this last stage, everyone has complete knowledge of all relevant facts, and no limits on knowledge remain, since the full system of rules required by the principles of justice has been determined in the first three stages of the four-stage sequence and apply to constrain their decisions about the application of laws to the circumstances they confront. Presuming that the laws written are done fairly without bias and corruption and are presumed by all to be fair, how would Rawls answer the question as to whether or not eminent domain should be used in this case? As mentioned above, Rawls' other major contribution to the social contract is the idea of the difference principle, which says that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantage. It basically requires that a society is to institute the economic system that would make the least advantaged class better off than they would be in any other feasible economic system, compatible with maintaining citizens' equal basic liberties and fair equality of opportunities. Rawls defines least advantage as those belonging to the lowest economic class with the least expectations. One vital piece of information that we have not considered up to this point is what is the situation of the homeowner who refuses to sell their home. Given Rawls' definition above of the least advantaged, our decisions hinge on the homeowner. If the homeowner is, for instance, a retiree living on a fixed income and the fair market value of her home is $100,000, and this would not enable her to afford comparable housing in the area, Rawls very well may come to the conclusion that the eminent domain would not be a just decision. Conversely, a multimillionaire holdout who is in their prime earning years may not receive the same consideration and may, against their will, be forced to sell to make way for the hospital, presuming that the cost-benefit ratio was done correctly, transparently, and without bias. Because the veil of ignorance concept drives compromise, it's very likely that any eminent domain law would demand market-based compensation for the homeowner should they be forced to relocate. I should note, John Rawls is an egalitarian, which, like utilitarianism, has its own distinct branches with differences in opinion of various kinds. Per Wikipedia, luck egalitarianism is based on the idea that arbitrary factors, such as accidents or illness, should not influence equality, and therefore people should be compensated for undeserved misfortune that impacts their interest. The idea has its origin in John Rawls' thought that distributive shares should not be influenced by arbitrary factors. Luck egalitarians disagree among themselves about the proper way to measure how well off people are. For instance, whether we should measure material wealth, psychological happiness, or some other factor, and the related issue of how to assess the value of the resources. Per an article on the NIH, Luck Egalitarianism, Individual Responsibility, and Health, luck egalitarians make a distinction between choice and luck. They label this distinction option luck and brute luck. If an individual takes prudent action for health but ends up with ill health, luck egalitarians call this brute luck. Brute luck is a category in which society owes her compensation for ill health because it occurs through reasons beyond her control. Option luck is where she is considered to have chosen a consequences by her imprudent behavior. If an individual acts imprudently by taking risks regarding her health and becoming ill, she has made her own choice. She had the option of doing things differently, but she did not. Going back to our scenario. Even if our retiree is in her situation due to reasons that could be contributed to option luck, an egalitarian viewpoint would still consider her in most situations to be the least advantaged and thus should be spared from eminent domain. This is because, for egalitarians, equality, not liberty, is a primary value. Before leaving Rawls and egalitarianism, I wanted to look at Peter Singer's response to Rawls. Singer, writing in his 2002 book One World Now, critiques the idea of the difference principle and the veil of ignorance, especially as they pertain to the idea of the least well-off. I quote, "To see how much our thinking about ethics needs to change, consider the work that, better than any other, represents late 20th century thinking on justice in the liberal American establishment. John Rawls's A Theory of Justice. When I read it shortly after its publication in 1971, I was astonished that a book with that title, nearly 600 pages long, could utterly fail to discuss the injustice of the extremes of wealth and poverty that exist between society. Rawls's method is to seek the nature of justice by asking which principles people would choose if they were choosing in conditions that prevented them from knowing what position they themselves would occupy. That is, they must choose whether knowing whether they themselves would be rich or poor, a member of the dominant ethnic majority or an ethnic minority, a religious believer or an atheist, highly skilled or unskilled, etc. If we were to apply this method globally rather than for a given society, it would immediately be obvious that one fact about which those making the choice should be ignorant is whether they are citizens of a rich country, such as the United States, or a poor country, such as Haiti. In setting up his original position, however, Rawls simply assumes that the people making the choice all belong to the same society and that are choosing principles to achieve justice within their society. Hence, when he argues that people choosing under the conditions he prescribes would choose a principle that, subject to constraints intended to protect equal liberties and fair equality of opportunity, seeks to improve the position of the worst off, he limits the conception of worst off to those within one's own society. If he accepts that to choose justly, people must also be ignorant of their citizenship, his theory would become a forceful argument for improving the prospects of the worst off people in the world. And now, a word from our sponsor. Do you enjoy reading but can't find book reviewers you connect with? Do you find booktubers more concerned with showing off their book hauls than reading to be as useful as solar-powered flashlights? You may enjoy another book review. It's a spoiler-free book review channel where I review everything from contemporary literature to classics, genre fiction such as sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, as well as a large dose of nonfiction. If you loved reading as a kid but fell out of the habit and are looking to jump back in, or if you never left in the first place, you'll find something to enjoy. That's Another Book Review on youtube.com. Robert Nozick, whose major work was published 3 years after A Theory of Justice, is entitled Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and contains many criticisms of Rawls. Per ChatGPT, they include the entitlement theory of justice. Nozick argued for a libertarian conception of justice based on entitlements rather than Rawls's focus on distributive justice. Nozick's entitlement theory asserts that individuals have rights to their holdings as long as they acquired them through legitimate means, such as voluntary exchange or acquisition, regardless of the resulting distribution of wealth and resources. The priority of liberty. Nozick emphasized the primacy of individual liberty over the pursuit of equality, a principle central to Rawls's theory. Nozick argued that individuals should be free to pursue their own ends without interference as long as they do not infringe upon the rights of others, even if this results in unequal distributions of resources or outcomes. The veil of ignorance and self-ownership. Nozick criticized Rawls's use of the veil of ignorance thought experiment as a basis for determining principles of justice. Instead, Nozick asserted that individuals have rights to themselves and their labor, which cannot be justly infringed upon, even for the sake of achieving more equal distributions of resources. The problem of distribution. Nozick challenged Rawls's focus on redistributive justice, arguing that any attempts to redistribute wealth or resources through taxation or other means inherently violate individuals' rights to their rightful holdings. Nozick advocated for a minimal state that only enforced property rights and contracts rather than one that actively seeks to redistribute wealth or promote social and economic equality. The critique of pattern principle. Nozick rejected Rawls's endorsement of pattern principles of justice, which aim to achieve a specific distributional pattern in society, such as equality. Instead, Nozick argued for historical principles of justice, which focused on how individuals legitimately acquire and transfer property rights over time without concern for achieving a particular pattern of distribution. Nozick is typically viewed through a libertarian lens and is considered by many to be one of the most prominent philosophers of that school of thought. His entitlement theory is quite simple. From the Entitlement Theory Wikipedia. Nozick's entitlement theory comprises three main principles. Principle number 1, a principle of justice in acquisition. This principle deals with the initial acquisition of holdings. It is an account of how people first come to own unowned and natural world property, which types of things can be held, and so forth. Principle number 2, a principle of justice in transfer. This principle explains how one person can acquire holdings from another, including voluntary exchange and gifts. Principle number 3, a principle of rectification of injustice. How to deal with holdings that are unjustly acquired or transferred, whether and how much victims can be compensated, how to deal with long past transgressions or injustices done by a government, and so on. Nozick believed that if the world was wholly just, only the first two principles would be needed, as the following inductive definition would exhaustively cover the subject of justice in holdings. 1. A person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principles of justice in acquisition is entitled to that holding. 2. A person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice in transfer from someone else entitled to the holding is entitled to the holding. No one is entitled to a holding except by repeated applications of 1 and 2. ChatGPT summed up Nozick's thought on eminent domain as follows. In his discussion of eminent domain, Nozick argued against its use on moral grounds. He believed that individuals have a right to property, which includes the right to acquire and maintain it without interference from the state or others. Therefore, he saw eminent domain as a violation of this right because it involves the state taking private property for public use, often with compensation to the owner. Nozick's objection to eminent domain stems from his broader principles of individual rights and limited government. He saw it as a coercive act by the state that undermines the freedom and autonomy of individuals to control their own property. However, he did acknowledge that there might be certain circumstances where eminent domain could be justified, such as when it is necessary for public safety or welfare, but he argued that such cases should be rare and subject to strict scrutiny to prevent abuse of power by the state. Under this viewpoint, Nozick rejects the difference principle. It would not matter who was in the house, just the homeowner came to the ownership of their property through legal means. And assuming that the state could not meet the strict scrutiny burden, let's say, for instance, that a private company is behind the construction of the hospital, and that this construction company has campaigned extensively to the point that it can be argued that the government's actions are being driven by private interest, then the taking of the home would not be considered a just action. If the decision is ultimately made that the government meets the burden of strict scrutiny, it must pay the homeowner fair market value for their property. Before we move on from Nozick, in addition to his critique of egalitarianism and Rawls, Nozick is also famous for a critique of utilitarianism through a thought experiment called the experience machine. Per ChatGPT, the experience machine, proposed by philosopher Robert Nozick in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, challenges ethical hedonism. Imagine a device that can create any desired experience for its user. If given the choice, would you prefer this stimulated reality over everyday life? Nozick argues that our desire for genuine experiences, the desire to be a certain type of person, and the limitations of a man-made reality all provide reasons not to plug into the machine. Essentially, pleasure alone isn't all that matters to us. There's more to life than just maximizing pleasure. Jeffrey Kaplan has a great YouTube video walking through this theory on his channel that I will post a link to in the show notes. I highly recommend checking it out if you find the idea interesting. Okay, to wrap things up, let's look at communitarianism. Communitarianism is a philosophy that emphasizes the importance of community and collective interest over individual rights. Its main tenets include 1. Community as central. Communitarianism posits that individuals are inherently social beings whose identities and values are shaped by their communities. Thus, it places a significant emphasis on the importance of strong, cohesive communities in fostering individual well-being and social harmony. 2. Balancing individual and community rights. While communitarianism values the community, it also acknowledges the importance of individual rights and freedoms. However, it suggests that individual rights must be balanced with the needs and values of the community to maintain social cohesion and promote the common good. 3. Emphasis on social responsibilities. Communitarianism stresses the importance of social responsibilities alongside individual rights. It argues that individuals have obligations to contribute to the well-being of their communities and to uphold shared values and norms. 4. Critique of excessive individualism. Communitarianism critiques the excess of individualism, which it views as leading to social fragmentation, isolation, and a lack of concern for the common good. It argues for a more balanced approach that values both individual autonomy and community solidarity. 5. Civic engagement and participation. Communitarianism encourages active civic engagement and participation as essential components of a healthy community, and emphasizes the importance of dialogue, cooperation, and collective decision-making in addressing common challenges and advancing shared goals. Communitarians differ as to how much sway the community should have in terms of rights in comparison with the individual, from some to a lot. I'll post a link to a video from Jack Miller, a YouTuber who provides a communitarian critique to egalitarianism via Rawls that I found interesting and well thought out. I'll expand more on the communitarian critique on utilitarianism below. Back to our scenario. Taken as a whole, what may a communitarian answer be to the mayor's dilemma? The mayor would expand the decision from his alone to the community as a whole. This could look like a community meeting where impacted parties could come together to speak their viewpoints and, hopefully, come to consensus. If there is still resistance from the homeowner, civic engagement and dialogue could be used as tools to fully understand the causes for reluctance and ideally come to a win-win solution, even if this entailed non-monetary forms of compensation bestowed on them by the community. An example could be the hospital is named after the homeowner in addition to receiving monetary compensation. It's important to note that consensus is not required under communitarianism. Consensus may not always be possible, but a harmonious coexistence should always be a goal, even if it is unlikely to be achieved in all situations. Obviously, from a practical standpoint, there are clear downsides to this method when compared to others. The first one being the amount of time and effort it would take for the community to come to a resolution akin to a win-win, assuming one exists at all. A situation where resentment builds towards the holdout homeowner could, in a small community, lead to a kind of shunning that would almost certainly cause a serious rift in the communal harmony. Also, as I understand it, communitarianism places a strong value on the values that the community members hold and the stories told about the community and beliefs they hold for themselves. If, for instance, the community strongly values military service, we support our veterans. Someone who is a veteran, even if this person is materially well off, may receive extra consideration when compared to someone who is not a member of that group. In our scenario, the wealthy homeowner who is a veteran may receive extra consideration than the indigent retiree, even if this is counterintuitive to most outside this community. While this may not be strange to the communitarians, the utilitarians and egalitarians may find it odd that a rule-based system is, to some degree, subverted in order to uphold exalted values in the community. Alistair MacIntyre and Michael Sandel are likely the two most prominent living proponents of communitarianism. In Sandel's Justice, he describes what is commonly known as the trolley problem. Suppose you are the driver of a trolley car hurtling down the track at 60 miles an hour. Up ahead, you see 5 workers standing on the track, tools in hand. You try to stop, but you can't. The brakes don't work. You feel desperate, because you know that if you crash into these 5 workers, they will all die. Let's assume you know that for sure. Suddenly, you notice a side track off to the right. There's a worker on that track, too, but only one. You realize that you can turn the trolley car onto the side track, killing the 1 worker but sparing the 5. This thought experiment, or a variation of it, is often used by utilitarians to simply, and might I add, powerfully, explain the basic tenets of their thinking, the greatest good for the greatest number. Building off of MacIntyre's major work, After Virtue, Sandel writes, in his book After Virtue 1981, he, MacIntyre, gives an account of the way we, as moral agents, arrive at our purposes and ends. As an alternative to the voluntarist conception of the person, MacIntyre advances a narrative conception. Human beings are storytelling beings. We live our lives as narrative's quest. I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. Sandel then goes on to write, to live a life is to extract a narrative quest that aspires to a certain unity or coherence. When confronted with competing paths, I try to figure out which path will best make sense of my life as a whole and of the things I care about. What does this have to do with the trolley problem? Well, let's twist the problem a bit. You're still driving the trolley, the brakes still don't work, there are still 5 people on one side of the track and 1 person on the other side. This time, the person on the other side, the 1 person, is a loved one. Imagine your child, parent, grandparent, niece, or nephew. Do you still have a moral obligation to save the 5 by killing the 1? I believe Sandel would say no, due to a concept he calls obligations of solidarity or membership. Family obligations is one such obligation he explicitly cites under this category in Justice. Why? I believe communitarians would argue that the obligation to family members, which are based on values that go back millennia in some cultures, supersedes the utilitarian impulse to save the greater number of people in the trolley problem, where other obligations of membership begin and end, and how to rank all the obligation of one's identity is not as easily answered, however. What have we learned by comparing these models? Some models emphasize the role of the individual, while others place a higher value on the role of the community when deciding how goods, rights, materials, and honors should be distributed. As the mayor of Roseland, a just decision may differ depending on the unique situation under which the law allowing eminent domain was passed, who it affects, who it excludes, and how it is perceived by the public or community. In other words, moral decisions are often tricky. A quick note as we wrap up. I have never taken a course in philosophy. These are my admittedly naive understandings of these topics and thinkers. Please do not cite this podcast in your intro to philosophy course. You'll probably get a D. Also, while I have my gripes with Michael Sandel, Justice is truly a great introduction to ethical thinking. I would highly recommend reading this book, or at the very least, checking out his series on YouTube, which I will post in the show notes. Thank you for listening to this episode of Elegant Ramblings. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel on iTunes or YouTube. You'll be able to find show notes there. Hope you enjoyed. Bye for now.